Born to Annoy, A Dawning of Awareness, Chapter 2, Droylsden. 22 Mossbank Avenue was and is a small semi-detached house on the corner of the cul-de-sac of that name and the north side of Hollyoake Street in the township of Droylsden. I presume the latter road takes its name from the great radical and noted historian of the early cooperative movement, George Jacob Hollyoake, for on the corner, at the end of the street where it meets the main Droylsden to Little Moss Road, Moorside Street, was our local branch store of the Droylsden Industrial Cooperative Society. This house, with a garden on 3 sides, was to be my home until my 8th birthday, when another surprise lay in store for me. That fateful Sunday, when Norman, my Auntie Dolly and Auntie Beatty's brother, and my father turned up at the house-cum-shop in Hazel Grove, was the biggest surprise of my short life. I had no memory of ever seeing Dad before that moment, just as I had no memory of the mother he would introduce me to on our arrival in my new abode. I was born on the 2nd of July 1944. Dad was in the army, and within weeks of my birth was participating in Operation Market Garden, the ill-fated attempt carried out jointly by the 1st Airborne Division and the Polish 1st Independent Parachute Brigade to liberate the Dutch city of Arnhem and secure the bridge across the river Nederin. This, of course, was a time when the Poles were particularly welcome for their much-needed assistance in the fight against fascism, a fact that the organisation, called UKIP, has evidently forgotten. Mum, I was later told, had suffered a painful and difficult birth when I finally made my way into the world. This in turn had triggered a mental illness she had suffered from since her mid-teens, namely schizophrenia. As a result, she'd been incarcerated in a mental hospital, and I'd been committed to my granddad's care. Now, in 1949, she was home again, and I was returned to the bosoms of my birth parents. What I didn't know was that by November, my beloved grandfather would be dead, and that particular Sunday when I'd kissed him goodbye would be the last time I would see him. To complicate the situation, within weeks my mother would once again be resident in a mental institution. Nonetheless, I soon settled down in my new home. Mum was a lovely, small, delicate woman, less than 5 foot tall. She was a seamstress, and had a sewing machine in the front room of the house, where she produced collars for men's shirts at great speed and in large quantities for some Manchester manufacturer. Dad wasn't much taller than Mum, and like her, always seemed ready to smile, 2 dimples forming under his cheeks whenever he did so. He was also slow to anger. Whatever else was to befall me, I was not destined to be on the receiving end of any violent chastisement, not even the slightest smack, at least not at home. Spare the rod and spoil the child was not a rule adhered to, either by my parents or my grandfather and his daughters. Quite the opposite, it was a rule treated with contempt and disgust. But, as I was to learn much later, the Cowles were not a typical English family, and their attitude to children and their welfare was at odds with all too many of their compatriots. Dad worked in neighbouring Higher Openshaw in Manchester for the high and medium voltage electrical switchgear manufacturer Ferguson Palin Limited, a company within the Associated Electrical Industries Group. Up to that point in his life, Dad's luck had been rather like the curate's egg, good in parts. He'd caught meningitis as a child, and consequently had missed out on a lot of education. As a result, he was a semi-skilled worker, employed in the small parts store, that is the department supplying the skilled workers, particularly the wiremen and fitters, with the nuts, bolts, washers and other fittings required to carry out their work. In those days, post-war construction was well in hand, unemployment non-existent, and the engineering industries had full order books both for home and export production. Britain's national electricity grid was being built and extended. New power stations were under construction to meet the needs of both domestic and business customers. Tall, stately galvanized steel pylons carrying the 132,000-volt cables from generating stations to the towns and villages of Britain sprouted over hill and dale. A huge national effort was underway, coordinated by the publicly owned and highly efficient British Electricity Authority and the local area distribution boards, with the aim of ensuring that not only industry had the energy it required to function effectively, but that the remotest cottage and farm would be provided with illumination and power. This was a project dear to the hearts of the capitalist owners of so-called free and private enterprise, but quite beyond the means of finance capital to address. Although the idea of public enterprise is now frowned upon, in those days it was seen as essential by thinking Tories and Labour politicians alike, if the needs of both the people in general and profit-hungry capitalists in particular were to be fulfilled. The companies within the umbrella of Associated Electrical Industries, principally British Thomson Houston, Metropolitan Vickers, Edison Swan and Ferguson Palin, were key manufacturers providing the hardware for this concerted effort. Their shareholders were, I presume, happy people. Profits came easy, guaranteed by the taxpayer, providing you had the cash to invest in the first place. Unfortunately, the engineers who designed and built the much-needed equipment and produced those profits earned low wages in return for long hours of labour. The unskilled and semi-skilled, like my dad, had to work many hours of overtime to make ends meet. Only the skilled women production workers and the apprentices suffered as bad or worse. The classic law of supply and demand, as articulated by the capitalist guru, the primitive economist Adam Smith, in his work of plagiarism, The Wealth of Nations, argued that when a commodity was in short supply and in great demand, its price would rise. This might apply to bread and tomatoes, but labour seemed another matter. Britain suffered from a severe shortage of skilled workers during all the years of my childhood, but history shows that when it came to the price of labour power, the natural and supposedly iron law of supply and demand had mysteriously been suspended. If we could achieve the same effect with gravity, we'd all be able to fly. This simple fact of life had a major impact on my young life. Whether that impact was for good or ill, however, depends on how you look at it. But enough of this serious stuff. That's for adults, and I was a 5-year-old in a strange new environment, imbued with a yearning for adventure and a desire to satisfy my natural inquisitiveness. I had time on my hands and a new and exciting world to explore. Unfortunately, I no longer had Grandad to supervise and direct my natural impulses, and there wasn't any substitute for him, as far as I was aware. For the last few weeks Mum was at home, I was content to watch her working at the sewing machine and listen to her humming and sometimes singing the Song of the Shirt, the poem by Thomas Hood, and other work ditties. I cannot sing, but I can recite the verse. With fingers weary and worn, with eyelids heavy and red, a woman sat in unwomanly rags, plying her needle and thread. Stitch, 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 in poverty, hunger, and dirt, and still with a voice of dolorous pitch, she sang the Song of the Shirt. Work, 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 while the cock is crowing aloof, and work, 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 till the stars shine through the roof. It's old to be a slave, along with the barbarous Turk, where woman has never a soul to save, if this is Christian work. Work, 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 till the brain begins to swim. Work, 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 till the eyes are heavy and dim. Seam and gusset and band, band and gusset and seam, till over the buttons I fall asleep, and sew them on in a dream. O men with sisters dear, O men with mothers and wives, it is not linen you're wearing out, but human creatures' lives. Stitch, 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 in poverty, hunger and dirt, sewing at once with a double thread, a shroud as well as a shirt. But why do I talk of death, that phantom of grisly bone? I hardly fear its terrible shape, it seems so like my own. It seems so like my own, because of the fasts I keep. O God, that bread should be so dear, and flesh and blood so cheap. Work, 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 my labour never flags, and what are its wages? A bed of straw, a crust of bread and rags. That shattered roof and this naked floor, a table, a broken chair, and a wall so blank, my shadow I thank for sometimes falling there. Work, 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 from weary chime to chime. Work, 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 as prisoners work for crime. Band and gusset and seam, seam and gusset and band, till the heart is sick and the brain benumbed, as well as the weary hand. Work, 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 in the dull December light, and work, 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 when the weather is warm and bright. While underneath the eaves the brooding swallows cling, as if to show me their sunny backs, and twit me with the spring. Oh, but to breathe the breath of the cowslip and primrose sweet, with the sky above my head and the grass beneath my feet, for only one short hour, to feel as I used to feel, before I knew the woes of want and the walk that costs a meal. Oh, but for one short hour, a respite, however brief, no blessed leisure for love or hope, but only time for grief. A little weeping would ease my heart, but in their briny bed my tears must stop, for every drop hinders needle and thread. With fingers weary and worn, with eyelids heavy and red, a woman sat in unwomanly rags, plying her needle and thread. Stitch, 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 in poverty, hunger and dirt, and still with a voice of dolorous pitch, would that its tone could reach the rich, she sang this song of the shirt. This home entertainment was augmented by applying crayons to paper, or playing out in the garden. The latter comprised a small patch of grass at the front, and a long patch of grass along the side of the house, which continued round the back, with an apple tree taking centre stage. In the left-hand corner of the back part of the garden, as you looked out from the back door, was a tall and magnificent caterpillar tree. What the correct name of this tree was I do not know, but to me it was the caterpillar tree, because at the right time of the year it was full of the bright green wriggling things. As I have already stated, it was just before my 5th birthday when I moved to Droylsden. This meant I had the whole of July and August and the first week of September before I would commence attendance at my new school. By the middle of July, Mum had left me once more, through events beyond her control. She would remain in a mental hospital until I was about 19 years of age. Dad had to be at work by 7 o'clock in the morning, and he didn't return home until 6:30 at night. He laboured 5.5 days a week, and although he tried not to show it, I instinctively knew he was usually worn out when he arrived home. I often climbed on his lap once we'd had our tea, and he'd sat in his favourite armchair to listen to the radio. Invariably he fell asleep before I did. I suppose from a modern social worker's point of view, This situation would be regarded as a major problem. Dad would no doubt have been written off as an inadequate parent, but that wasn't the way I saw it. Mrs. Worrell next door was on hand whenever I was hungry or thirsty, as were other neighbours in Mossbank Avenue. I quickly learned how to manipulate their natural generosity, without making too much of a nuisance of myself, I hope. But more importantly, from my point of view, I was at liberty, the back door key safely tied round my neck with twine and hidden in my shirt, and I meant to take maximum advantage of my new situation. Before I relate my adventures, however, let's see if I can paint a word picture of my new environment. Droylsden in those days was a large textile village rapidly growing into a small town. Its nearest neighbours were Openshaw, famous as a major heavy engineering centre to the southwest, and Clayton, an engineering and chemical manufacturing township to its west. It shared a common border with both, although unlike Droylsden they had been incorporated into the city of Manchester, the centre of which lay some 4 miles away further to the west. To its northwest and north lay the townships of Newton Heath and Failsworth, separated from Droylsden by the river Medlock and its verdant valley. To the immediate northeast and east, and within a short distance from Mossbank Avenue, was the open countryside of Little Moss, Ashton Moss and Daisy Nook, much of it river valley, rough pasture and peat moss. On the latter, market gardens flourished, not least that of Bill Sourbutt's, one of the first and legendary members of the BBC radio's Gardener's Question Time team. Ashton-under-Lyne, another textile town, lay some 2¼ miles to the northeast. Across the flat levels of the moss, looking north and eastwards, rose the dark, brooding hills of the Pennines, the natural barrier between the cotton towns of Lancashire and the woollen towns of the West Riding of Yorkshire, and populated in my fertile mind by a strange assortment of cowboys and Indians, cattle and sheep rustlers, highwaymen and other assorted villains. Some would say this is rather a good description of Yorkshire folk, but I know from experience such people are simply prejudiced and ignorant. The mechanised cotton industry had come rather late to Droylsden, and above all of its varied textile output, one particular product made it world famous. The town was the primary producer of Turkish towels and toweling in the world, and many of the locals claimed their version was an improvement on the original, although I doubt if Turkish spinners and weavers would agree. Turkish towels, I hear you say in disbelief, but Turkish towels it was. Christie's had founded their first mill in the then village in 1837, and in 1851 they produced the world's first machine-woven towel, the terry towel. Henry Christie, the son of the founder, visited Turkey in the 1840s, and returned with a loop fabric towel typical of that country's rather unique product, and far superior to anything then available in Britain. The company's innovative millwrights managed to adapt a loom to reproduce the complicated weave. The mill owner's Royal Turkish towels soon became famous, not least because Queen Victoria insisted on a regular supply. And as the Christie family and their financial backers flourished, so the handloom weavers and spinners of Turkey were impoverished, unable to compete with either the price or the quantity of the machine-produced substitutes flooding the international markets. The Christie mill eventually closed at the end of the 1980s, finally succumbing in its turn to the superior technology of the Far East and the rise of the disposable nappy. Pampers have a lot to answer for. But I'm allowing myself to fall into the trap of hindsight once more. These issues had nothing to do with a 5-year-old, although the fact Droylsden was a textile town did. Textiles meant steam power, and that meant water, both for the boilers of the mill engines and the means of transport for raw cotton, coal and finished goods. This in turn meant mill dams, rivers and canals in close proximity, and mill dams, rivers and canals were rich sources of amusement, education and exploration, especially for a 5-year-old like me. Railways, and in particular their embankments, cuttings, bridges, and other paraphernalia, were further icing on the cake, as were the open fields with their hedgerows full of all kinds of birds and wildlife, and delicious fruits in their season. And if that wasn't sufficient to stimulate the adventurous spirit, to top it all off, there were the added temptations of the market gardens on the moss, a rich source of salad and other vegetables, which Grandad Cowle had taught me were an essential part of any growing boy's diet, a statement that both Auntie Dolly and Auntie Beatty had endorsed on many an occasion. This varied landscape was mine to explore, and sometimes, like a one-boy Mongol horde, to plunder. In turn, it would help mould and shape my character, and formulate some of my earliest ideas on the nature of life, the world of nature, and that of mankind, and my humble and tiny role within both.